I didn't mean to find out that way, and if I'm being honest, I don't think there is any way a man is supposed to discover that his marriage has been quietly collapsing behind his back through the calm, obedient voice of a machine sitting on his kitchen counter. But that's exactly how it happened. Not with confrontation or suspicion or even a gut feeling, but with a playback feature I didn't even know existed until that night when I was trying to fix a minor glitch in our shared Alexa system. The kind of harmless domestic task that fills the empty spaces of routine, and I remember scrolling absent-mindedly through settings, tapping through menus without much thought, until I saw the option labeled Voice History, and something about it caught my attention. Maybe curiosity, maybe boredom, maybe the strange instinct that sometimes nudges you toward truths you're not ready to face. And I tapped it, expecting nothing more than a list of weather checks and music requests, the ordinary digital footprint of a quiet household. But what I found instead was something else entirely, something that didn't belong to routine at all. At first, it was nothing obvious, just scattered commands, her voice asking for reminders, timers, grocery lists, and I almost exited out of it, almost dismissed the whole thing as pointless. But then I noticed the timestamps, late at night, hours when I wasn't home, hours when I had been working late or convincing myself that I was working late. And I don't know why I pressed play on the first recording. Maybe it was instinct, maybe it was chance, but the moment her voice filled the room, soft and familiar and unaware it was being preserved, I felt something tighten inside me, something I couldn't yet name. "Alexa, play that song again," she said, and there was laughter in her voice, a kind of lightness I hadn't heard in years. And then, faintly in the background, another voice answered, a man's voice, low and comfortable. The kind of voice that doesn't belong to a stranger, and I froze, my hand hovering over the screen, as if touching it again would somehow erase what I had just heard. But instead, I pressed the next recording, and the next, and the next, each one unraveling something I didn't fully understand yet, but could feel growing heavier with every second. In one recording, she asked Alexa to set a timer, and while it counted down, I could hear them talking. Not loudly, not carefully either, just naturally, like two people who didn't expect to be overheard, and that was the moment it hit me, not all at once but in pieces, like glass breaking slowly, that these weren't accidents, these weren't isolated moments. This was a pattern, a hidden rhythm inside my own home that I had somehow missed completely. I sat down without realizing it, the kitchen chair scraping quietly against the floor, and I kept listening, because once you open a door like that, you can't close it halfway. You either step through, or you pretend it was never there, and I wasn't capable of pretending anymore. The recording stretched back weeks, maybe months. I didn't even check how far, because time stopped meaning anything as I listened. As I heard her laugh again and again in ways she no longer laughed with me, as I heard conversations that were casual and intimate and devastating in their normalcy, because that was the worst part. Not the obvious betrayal, not even the presence of another man, but the ease of it, the way it fit into her life as if it had always belonged there. I tried to remember when things had changed between us, when the distance had started. But memory is unreliable when you're searching for a single moment that explains everything. Because there is never just one moment. There are dozens, hundreds, small shifts you ignore until they become something permanent. I thought about the nights I came home late, the nights I chose work over conversation, the times I dismissed her when she tried to talk, and for a brief, dangerous second, I wondered if this was somehow my fault, if I had created the silence that someone else eventually filled. But then another recording played, one where she whispered something I couldn't unhear, something that erased any attempt I made to rationalize what I was discovering, and I felt something inside me snap, not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly and completely. I didn't confront her that night. I couldn't, because confrontation requires clarity, and all I had was a storm of voices echoing inside my head. Her voice, his voice. Alexa's neutral tone marking timestamps like a witness that couldn't be questioned, and I realized then that truth doesn't always arrive in a way that allows you to respond immediately. Sometimes it arrives in pieces you have to survive first. I stayed there in the kitchen long after the recording stopped playing, staring at the device that had unknowingly documented the unraveling of my marriage. And I thought about how strange it was that something designed to listen had become the only thing that had truly heard what was happening inside my own home. Because I hadn't heard it. Not when it mattered. Not when it could have changed anything, and now it was too late for prevention, too late for ignorance, and all that remained was the question of what I would do with the truth I'd never meant to find. I didn't sleep that night, not even for a minute, because every time I closed my eyes, I could hear it again, her laughter echoing out of that small device. Light and unguarded in a way that felt foreign to me now, as if I had been living beside a version of her that wasn't entirely real, or maybe I was the one who had become unreal to her. and I kept replaying the recordings in my head, trying to piece together a timeline, trying to understand how long this had been happening without my knowledge, how many evenings, how many quiet absences had been filled by someone else, while I convinced myself that everything was fine simply because it wasn't openly broken. By morning, the house felt different, not physically. Nothing had moved or changed, but there was a tension in the air that hadn't been there before. Or maybe it had always been there and I had only just learned how to recognize it. And when she walked into the kitchen, her hair still slightly messy from sleep, her expression soft and familiar, I felt a strange disconnect, like I was looking at someone I knew intimately and not at all at the same time. She smiled at me, asked if I wanted coffee, and her voice was the same voice I had heard in those recordings. But now I couldn't hear it without also hearing the echo of someone else in the background, and it made everything feel layered, distorted, like reality had split into two overlapping versions and I was stuck in between them. I said yes. Of course I did, because routine is a powerful thing. It keeps you grounded when everything else feels like it's slipping, and I watched her move around the kitchen, watched the small, ordinary gestures I had seen 1,000 times before, and I wondered how many of those same gestures had been repeated in my absence for someone else. How many mornings or afternoons had mirrored this exact scene with a different audience. I wanted to ask her right then and there. I wanted to put the truth on the table and force it into the open, but something held me back, not fear exactly, but a need to understand more before I shattered what was left of us. Because once spoken, things like that can't be taken back, and I wasn't ready to step into whatever came after. So instead I watched, and I listened, really listened this time, not just to her words, but to the spaces between them, the pauses, the subtle shifts in tone. And I realized how much I'd stopped paying attention over the years. How easy it had been to assume that presence was the same as connection, that being in the same room meant we were still together in the ways that mattered. That day I didn't go to work. I told them I was sick, which wasn't entirely a lie, because something inside me was definitely not functioning the way it should. And after she left the house, after the door closed behind her and the silence settled in, I went back to the Alexa device, back to the recordings, because they were the only concrete thing I had. The only evidence that what I heard the night before wasn't some kind of misinterpretation or overreaction. I listened more carefully this time, noting dates, times, patterns, and slowly, a clearer picture began to form, one that was harder to deny with each passing minute, because this wasn't random. It wasn't occasional, it was consistent, almost routine in its own way, and the realization of that hurt more than anything else, because routine means comfort, and comfort means familiarity. And familiarity means this wasn't new, it was established. I found one recording that made everything sharper, more defined, a conversation where she mentioned my schedule. Casually, the way you might mention the weather. "He'll be late tonight," she said. And there was a pause, and then the man's voice responded, something low and amused, and I felt something cold settle in my chest. Because in that moment, I understood that my absence wasn't just coincidence, it was part of the structure, part of how this had been built and maintained without my awareness. I sat there for hours, long enough for the sunlight to shift across the floor, long enough for time to lose its usual meaning, and by the end of it, I wasn't just hurt or angry. I was aware in a way I had never been before, aware of how much I had missed, how much I had chosen not to see, and that awareness came with a kind of clarity that felt almost dangerous, because it stripped away any illusions I might have used to protect myself. When she came home that evening, everything looked the same again on the surface, but I knew it wasn't. I knew I wasn't. And as she greeted me, as she moved through the house like she always did, I realized that whatever happened next, whatever choices I made, there was no going back to the version of my life that existed before I pressed play. I decided to hear it live, not just through recordings filtered by time and memory, because there is a difference between knowing something happened and witnessing it in the moment it unfolds. And that difference felt important now, not for proof, I already had that, but for something harder to define, something closer to certainty, the kind that settles deep enough inside you that doubt no longer has anywhere to hide. So I left the house that afternoon the way I always did, keys in hand, a brief goodbye, the familiar rhythm of departure that had unknowingly become part of their routine. And I drove just far enough to make it believable before circling back, parking down the street where my car wouldn't be obvious, my heart beating harder with every step I took back toward the house that was supposed to be mine. I didn't go inside immediately. Not at first. I stood near the side of the house, close enough to hear if voices carried, and for a few long minutes there was nothing. Just the quiet hum of an ordinary day, and I almost convinced myself I had made a mistake, that I had misread everything, that the recordings had somehow misled me, but then I heard it. Faint at first, then clearer, her laughter again, unmistakable, followed by his voice, and something inside me steadied instead of breaking, because this time there was no shock left, only confirmation. I entered the house quietly, not trying to hide exactly, but not announcing myself either, moving through the hallway with a strange calm that didn't match the situation. And as I got closer to the living room, their voices became clearer, words blending into something intimate and ordinary all at once, and I realized that this moment was what had been happening again and again, without me, this hidden version of my life that had existed just out of reach. When I finally stepped into the room, they didn't notice me immediately, and for a second I saw them exactly as they were when they thought they were alone, relaxed, unguarded, real in a way that made everything else feel like a performance. And then she turned, and everything stopped. The look on her face wasn't just surprise, it was recognition, the instant understanding that the version of reality she had been maintaining had just collided with the truth, and neither of us spoke right away, because some moments are too full for words, too final for anything as simple as explanation. He stood up slowly, his expression shifting from confusion to awareness as he looked between us, and I wondered briefly what she had told him about me. What version of me existed in his mind before this moment, but that question didn't matter anymore. None of the smaller questions did, because the larger truth was standing right there in front of all of us, undeniable and complete. How long? I asked eventually, and my voice sounded calmer than I expected, almost detached, as if I were asking about something distant instead of something that had been happening inside my own life. And she hesitated, not because she didn't know the answer, but because she did, and saying it out loud would give it weight it had never had before. He didn't speak at all, he just watched, and I realized then that whatever existed between them, whatever shape it had taken, it wasn't built to withstand this kind of exposure. It had thrived in secrecy, in the quiet spaces where consequences didn't have to exist. She tried to explain, of course she did, words spilling out in fragments, justifications, apologies, pieces of a story that might have made sense before but sounded hollow now, and I listened. Not because I believed her, but because I needed to hear it, needed to let the reality settle fully into place so there would be no part of me left that could deny it later. When she finished, when the room fell quiet again, I realized something unexpected, something that surprised even me. I wasn't angry in the way I thought I would be, not explosive, not uncontrollable. Instead, I felt clear, almost painfully clear, like a fog had lifted and revealed everything exactly as it was, without distortion. I know, I said, and those two words carried more weight than anything else I could have added, because they meant I had seen it, heard it, understood it, and there was no version of this where things could return to what they had been before. I didn't yell, I didn't argue, I didn't ask him to leave or her to choose, because those actions belonged to a version of me that still believed this was something that could be fixed. And I no longer believe that, not after everything I had heard, everything I had seen, everything I had ignored for so long. Instead, I turned and walked away, not out of weakness, but out of certainty, because staying in that room would have meant participating in a reality that no longer existed for me. And as I stepped outside, into the open air that suddenly felt sharper and more real than anything inside those walls, I understood that the discovery had not ended my marriage in that moment. It had ended long before, quietly and unnoticed, and all I had done was finally catch up to the truth. The strange thing about endings is that they rarely feel like endings. When they happen, they feel like pauses, like standing in a space where something used to exist and trying to understand where it went. And in the days that followed, that's exactly where I found myself, not in grief, the way I had imagined. Not in rage either, but in a quiet, almost unsettling clarity that made everything sharper, more defined, as if the world had been slightly out of focus for years and had only just corrected itself. I stayed away from the house after that, not out of avoidance, but because it no longer felt like mine, not in the way a home is supposed to feel. And I realized that ownership isn't about names on paper or shared routines. It's about presence, about truth, about what exists when no one is pretending. And that house had been built on something else entirely. She called me, of course she did, more than once. Her voice different now, stripped of the ease I had heard in those recordings, replaced with something uncertain, something searching. And I listened the first time, let her speak, let her try to rebuild something out of words that came too late, and I understood then that timing matters more than intention. That apologies offered after discovery are not the same as honesty offered before it, and I didn't interrupt her, didn't argue, didn't accuse, because none of that would have changed anything that had already been set into motion long before I ever opened that voice history. When she asked if we could fix it, I paused, not because I was considering it, but because I wanted to answer in a way that was true, not reactive, not shaped by the moment, but by everything that had led up to it. And I told her no, simply and clearly, because what had been broken wasn't just trust. It was reality itself. And once reality fractures like that, it doesn't go back to its original shape. it becomes something else entirely, something you can't unknow or unsee. The legal process was straightforward compared to the emotional one. Papers filed, accounts divided, decisions made in rooms where everything is reduced to facts and figures. And in a way, that simplicity was a relief, because it required nothing from me except presence. And presence was something I was relearning how to give. I avoided the Alexa device after that, left it unplugged on the kitchen counter the last time I saw it, because it had done its part. It had revealed what I needed to see, and I didn't need to hear anything else. Didn't need to revisit those recordings or search for more evidence, because truth, once fully understood, doesn't require repetition. What surprised me most was not how much I had lost, but how much space was left behind. Space I didn't know how to fill at first. Long evenings without routine, without the quiet assumption of someone else's presence, and for a while, that space felt heavy, like something missing rather than something gained, but slowly, almost imperceptibly, it began to shift, to feel less like absence and more like possibility. I started paying attention to things I'd ignored before, the sound of my own thoughts without interruption, the rhythm of my own choices. The simple act of deciding how to spend a day without considering someone else's expectations, and I realized that for a long time, I had been moving through life on a kind of autopilot, fulfilling roles, maintaining structures, without ever really asking myself if they were still true, still real, still mine. There were moments when memories surfaced, good ones, because not everything had been false, and I allowed those memories to exist without trying to rewrite them or attach them to what I knew now. Because understanding the end of something doesn't erase the fact that it once existed in a different form, and I didn't need to turn the past into something entirely negative to justify leaving it behind. The last time I heard her voice was not through a recording or a phone call, but in person, brief and quiet. A conversation that felt more like closure than anything else. And there was no anger left in it, just recognition. Two people acknowledging that whatever had once connected them no longer did. And as I walked away from that final exchange, I felt something settle inside me, not happiness exactly, but resolution, the kind that doesn't need to be announced or explained, it simply exists. Now, when I think back to the moment I opened that voice history, the moment everything began to unravel, I don't see it as the point where my life fell apart. I see it as the point where it finally became honest. Because before that, I was living inside something I didn't fully understand. Something that functioned on assumption and routine rather than awareness. And that awareness, as painful as it was to gain, gave me something I hadn't realized I was missing. The ability to choose my life with open eyes. And if there's one thing I've learned from all of it, it's that truth doesn't always arrive in the way you expect or the way you would choose. Sometimes it comes through something as ordinary as a device on a kitchen counter, quietly recording what you failed to notice, waiting until you're ready or forced to finally listen. And once you do, once you truly hear it, there's no going back, only forward into whatever comes next, with a clarity you didn't have before. And maybe that's not the ending I would have written for myself, but it's the one that gave me back something far more important than the life I thought I had. It gave me the life I actually chose.